If you're going to explore the idea of change management, there's a couple of different kinds of change management that you might want to talk about. If we're going through a transformation to Agile, what does change management look like in the context of an Agile transformation? The other thing that you might consider is if you are doing software requirements and if you are adapting to changing requirements as articulated by the customer against a fixed time, fixed cost, fixed scope, you might ask yourself how change management happens in the context of like the actual software project. So for the purposes of this, I'm going to kind of assume that we're talking about change management as part of an Agile transformation initiative. So if you think about how Agile is often introduced into an organization, it's usually introduced from a practices first approach. So, you bring people into an Agile training class, you teach them how to do Scrum, or you teach them how to do SAFe, and then they go back into their work environments and they adopt a set of new practices. Or maybe they go through some sort of Agile orientation that is more culture focused, that's around empowering people and collaboration and teamwork and things like that. So if you look at it like very simply, the change management isn't a whole lot. It's really, we're sending people to class and then they're going back and they're doing a new process. The reason why that kind of approach doesn't require a tremendous amount of change management is because really nothing around the team is fundamentally changing. So it's existing org structures, it's existing teaming strategies, it's existing organizational design, it's existing governance, it's existing metrics, it's existing controls. But Agile is largely seen as something that the teams do like at the work surface level. Okay. When you look at what we look at in terms of LeadingAgile looks at in terms of Agile transformation, right? We take very much a systems first approach. And so when we go in, we're looking at the org design, what we're forming teams around. Are we forming them around business capabilities? Are we forming them around products? Are we forming them around feature sets? Are we forming teams around components, objects within the organization, different services within the organization? And then we're looking at the governance model. How do you handle the interaction model between different teams, different parts of the organization? We're looking in terms of what you measure and control across your organization. Because our belief is to get Agile really working, that you have to have well-formed teams. Those teams have to be operating off of authoritative backlogs, and you have to be able to produce a working tested increment of software at the end of every sprint. And so because we're taking a more systematic view, a more organizational design, organizational ecosystem view to change, we're disrupting a lot more things. Okay? And so in that context, right, one of the things that we believe is that the transformation has to be much more systematic. So when you take a systems first approach to transformation, what you have to do, there's a couple of different dimensions. So one of the things that you have to do is that you have to manage the expectations of everybody around you. So we have this set of things that we talk about. You might call it like a system of engagement or an engagement design, where there is a progressive engagement of the enterprise to help people understand what is happening. We just kicked off with a client this week. It's going to be a rather large global transformation. And the first step that we did is we got everybody into a virtual room for 4 days and introduced a lot of the really key ideas that we believe are essential for leading an Agile transformation. So, the first thing that we do is we start to think about how do you attach the transformation to business value. So are you going for predictability? Are you going for cost savings? Are you going for better quality, innovation, and product fit? And then you start introducing ideas like systems first. And then you start introducing teams, backlogs, working tested software. You start to introduce ideas around structure, governance, and metrics. You start talking about expeditions and base camps, which is language LeadingAgile uses to describe our incremental and iterative approach to Agile transformation. Then you start to look at how are you going to structure specifically the organization? How are you going to govern the organization? How are you going to set up metrics and controls? How are you going to measure the transformation? And so, this idea of kind of progressive understanding of what the transformation means to an organization. You have to enlist the leadership into that so they understand the things that you're going to do, right? The actual work of doing the transformation. Then coming out of that, you identify a part of the organization that you might look to do a pilot in. And there's going to be some discovery and some enlistment in that, right? So we're going to take a deep dive look at the business capabilities within the organization, the product model hierarchy, the technology architecture, the org design, and create a hypothesis for how we're going to form teams across the organization. You look at where dependencies are strong in the organization. And so you're going to have a way of managing and dealing with dependencies proactively. You're going to have a way of creating flow across teams. You're going to have a way of measuring the actual performance of the system. You have to come up with tooling strategies. The process around that is lots of interviewing, lots of analysis, lots of information gathering, lots of synthesis, and lots of collaboration between us and the customer in terms of helping them progressively understand what we're going to do. So while the 2-day workshop tends to be like very thematic, very high level, very directional, when you start to get into the pilot and you start doing the define the end state work around the pilot, it starts to get very specific in terms of what that organization is going to look like, how it's going to operate, what the assumptions we're making, who's going to be involved, how it's going to happen. And then once we have a broad-based agreement around that, then you go through and you start to implement a pilot. And the reason why the pilot is so important from a change management perspective is that what we need a bright, shining North Star that everybody can point to. One of the challenges we often have is you get through some of the define the end state work and everybody gets really excited and they say, okay, let's do everybody all at one time. The challenge with doing that without having a really solid working instantiation of the model is that it proliferates out in the organization in a very different way. Okay, so 2-day workshop, define the end state, pilot, and then once the pilot is complete, sometimes we do multiple pilots to capture different characteristics within the enterprise. But now we have a rollout, right? So if it's a really large transformation, we might have 100 or 200 or 300 expeditions of about 80 to 100 people that are systematically going through this. So now you start to talk about, okay, now that we've created shared cognition across the organization, the next phase of things that I think about is how do we create things like executive steering committees, like who on the leadership team needs to be actively engaged and informed and actually improving the organization, because there's a lot of changes that are going to have to be made within the transformation that are not team level things. They're not just process things. It's, getting approval to, do some reorganization work, to change how governance works, to change how measurement works. And it absolutely requires the continuous engagement, the enlistment, and then continuous engagement of the leadership team so that they're actively participating in the management of the change for their organization. And depending upon the size and the scope, often we'll have like an executive steering committee that operates almost at like a portfolio level or an investment tier level for the transformation. And then the different lower level parts of the organization, we might organize like more of a middle management kind of team. We call it a transformation leadership team that is ultimately responsible for taking the parts of the organization and breaking it down into outcomes-based plans and activities and coaching strategies and things like that. And so you imagine this hierarchy of ESC at the top managing the portfolio, transformation leadership teams at the middle tier that's really doing the work decomposition, And then you have coaching teams down at the lowest level working with the newly formed teams, getting them coached in the practices, getting them able to produce a working tested backlog at the end of every sprint. And so the model for transformation becomes very similar to like a scaled framework for how you might manage an agile system of delivery. Okay, but the key from a change management perspective is that you have the senior leadership team enlisted constantly and engaged constantly, at least monthly, ideally weekly. The transformation leadership team is managing the work of the transformation on an ongoing basis, very much like a product owner might engage with different scrum teams, decomposing the work, understanding what's important, clearing roadblocks, understanding cross team dependencies and such. And then you have the work surface where you actually have the teams working. So that structure of leadership and engagement is absolutely essential for keeping the organization engaged, keeping them enlisted. The third thing that I might say is communication management. So a big part of like what we do, because we take a phased approach to transformation, an incremental and iterative approach to transformation, oftentimes we're working with small subsets of the organization, doing pilots, doing early stage expeditions. And a lot of times the rest of the organization doesn't know what is going on. So the more that we can proactively report out on the progress of the parts that are changing. A lot of times we'll go out ahead of the parts that are changing into the parts that are later in the roadmap and do some preliminary change, not change management, but education, where we're talking about different patterns of org design, different teaming strategies, different roles and responsibilities, getting the rest of the organization prepared and excited. And then again, also informed as to what's happening within the organization. So you think about it kind of in like three ways, right? So you've got the progressive engagement through workshops, define the end states, pilots, rollout, right? That's one way of getting the organization to understand what is going on all the time. And then you have the systematic engagement of leadership from executives to middle management down to the team level execution, because those folks have to be involved constantly in terms of managing their transformation. And then the third part, really communication management, education, proactive, letting people know what's coming, letting them know what we're doing, letting them know where we're at in terms of progress against plan. So like, why aren't other folks doing it this way? And then maybe like a fast follow to that question is what makes this kind of transformation engagement really difficult? So one of the things that I find, it's really part of our sales cycle, it's really part of our go-to-market strategy, is we have to get people, LeadingAgile has to get people to believe that this is fundamentally a systems problem. It's really about teaming strategies, it's about governance, it's about metrics. And, that comes first for us. And then a really fast follow is once you have the teaming strategies and the governance and the metrics identified and you're going through the process of installing it, there's a lot of practices that enable that new operating model. So you need to understand the fundamentals of Scrum. You need to understand Kanban at the team level. You need to understand Kanban at the program and portfolio level. You need to understand concepts like release management. You need to, if you're going to implement SAFe, you need to understand the ideas of big room planning and release trains and product increments. If you're doing something like large-scale Scrum, you need to understand the impact of dependencies and how dependencies need to be decoupled over time. Our belief around that is that those things are fairly knowable and they can be anticipated and they need to be proactively addressed. A lot of organizations that we go into just don't believe it's that hard, right? So what they're basically operating under is the idea that if I teach people how to do Scrum or I teach people how to do SAFe, then what will happen is that the teams will start to do those practices. And then as they engage, as those practices engage, we'll discover impediments. And then those impediments will get systematically removed over time. So in practice, though, what I often see is that the kinds of impediments that large complex organizations are going to uncover, things like organizational design, things like technical dependencies, things like audit and compliance and how projects are funded. There's a lot of things that live outside the team that are not within the purview of the team to change. And so if leadership isn't fully prepared for that, then what's going to happen is that those teams are going to uncover the impediments, but rather than actually go into the enterprise and work to get those impediments resolved, what they tend to do is they tend to kind of dilute the intent of the different agile methodologies, whether at the team level or scaled, and you end up with an ineffective version of practices because the organizational design considerations weren't addressed. And so at the point that you recognize that culture isn't the place that you start, right? So you don't teach people how to be more empowering leaders first. That can be a really fast follow, but like that's not where it starts. Practices of Scrum and SAFe are not where that conversation starts. If you believe that that's where it starts, then what happens is you say, well, I don't need a bunch of change management. I just need to be able to train the people how to do it. At the point that you realize that it's actually an ecosystem, an organizational ecosystem problem, structure, governance, and metrics, then you start to think about like, well, okay, how do I start to really go in and change this organization in a way that's safe and effective? Because the kinds of changes that we're recommending making are not just things that you can just do ad hoc. I mean, we're changing, possibly reporting relationships. We have impacts to HR. We have impacts to the technology stack and release management and all these different things. And so that stuff needs to be done very, very thoughtfully. And so this metaphor that we use in Leading Agile of expeditions and base camps is a way of basically taking slices of the organization and getting them to a next known, next best state. So generally an expedition is a group of teams, a group of people that operate like at a program or product tier, a group of people that operate at a portfolio tier, maybe an investment tier, and we take that organization and we do the org design, we design the governance, we design the metrics, we design the tooling strategies, we get people really clear on what teams they're going to be a part of and how those teams are going to interact with each other and what they're responsible for. And then over a period of 3 to 4 months, get them to an incredibly tight, known, working next state. And when you do it that way, what happens is you get this group, this expedition to the next known state. And then you get the next expedition to the next known state, the next expedition to the next known state. We have, I mentioned this idea of expeditions to base camps. So for that is an expedition, I mentioned, is this vertical stack of teams at different levels of the organization within a new operating model. But the base camps are a way of saying, okay, what are the conditions that we're trying to create? So to start off with, often we're talking about like, let's get the system really predictable. Because we know that in an early stage transformation, there's a lot of dependencies. There's a lot of environmental concerns that aren't resolved yet. And so if you just go and you just drop in agile practices on top of a system that isn't ready for it, then it's often going to fail right out of the gate. Even if you start to get the system ready, what you recognize is that not all of the changes can happen all at one time. So a lot of the strategy, the change management strategy, is let's get the teams formed, let's get the governance models in place, let's get the system reliable and predictable. So that way the existing organization can delegate into that collection of teams and get that collection of teams reliable and predictable, able to make and meet commitments. And then once that team's able to make and meet commitments, then we can start thinking about changing release management processes and to start to do more things with continuous integration, continuous deployment, more automation, more DevOps. Then you start to think about, okay, once you got the teams operating in small batches, now you can really see the cost of the dependencies, and you can start to economically weight those dependencies, and you can make the appropriate investments to get different teams and different parts of the organization functionally decoupled from each other. Once you have the teams functionally decoupled from each other, now they can operate independently, and you can start to look at things like, how do I do like a product-driven organization? How can I do funding at the team or work group level or business unit level? Because now they're decoupled and they don't have dependencies between them. Once you have independent operating units that are funded independently, now we can start to do more of the pure play Agile experimentation. So again, from a change management perspective, it's not all at one time when you're making these kinds of systematic structural changes. You got to break the organization into slices, get it to a next known state, get the organization really comfortable with how it's going to work, and then after you have a really solid working pattern, start to not only advance that pattern out into more slices of the organization, but then to take different slices that you've transformed to greater levels of maturity, greater levels of agility as you go. And so again, it all comes down to this idea of what is it that we're actually trying to change? We're not just trying to change practices. We're not just trying to change culture. We're trying to change the actual operating model of the organization, then enable it with practices, and then to guide more of a spirit of inspect and adapt and empowerment and trusting people, because we have a reliable system that you can delegate into. What makes this hard? Well, I mean, everything about what we do, from videos like this to what we do in a sales cycle to what we do in the early stage workshops, is really about convincing people that this is the nature of the problem. That if you don't change these things, then you're not going to be successful. Some people just want to believe that there's an easy button. And, for certain sizes of organizations, really small organizations, 3-4 teams, maybe a work group or two, maybe if you're just trying to do an Agile project, maybe it isn't this complicated. But for some of the large enterprise clients that we're working with, this is the issue. So, initially getting over the belief. Other things that I think are impediments to change is that oftentimes there is plausible deniability between different groups. So, largely we'll talk about the business, right? So anything other than actual product delivery, sometimes we'll just kind of colloquially call the business. So it could be the product management organization. It could be everything around the product management organization, maybe as separate from delivery. And so a lot of times there's plausible deniability. The teams haven't been really good at making and meeting commitments. And so the business can throw things over the wall to the teams, and then there's this idea that, well, the teams are underperforming. The business is doing everything right, but the teams are underperforming. With the teams, a lot of times they view the business as being dysfunctional. It's so like nobody initially wants to kind of throw in with each other. So a lot of times what we do to overcome that is get the delivery systems really, really working really well. But we don't really try to change the business right out of the gate. Ideally, it's best if we can do both at the same time. But if I can get the teams, and by that I mean like the full stack, team level, program, portfolio, investment tier. If I can get that working in a more agile way, and then teach the business how to exploit the new capabilities. Once the system has become trustworthy, how do I learn how to trust it? Right? That's one thing that we have to overcome, is this plausible deniability, because nobody wants to kind of get in bed with anybody else, because there's like nobody wants the other one to be able to blame them for the lack of performance. Then sometimes it's just a matter of like people are really, really overworked, and we want the business and we want the development group to engage and to be actually collaborative. But the business is often understaffed, and they're out trying to move markets and sell things and go to trade shows and do all the things that the product and the business does. And what they want to be able to do is just kind of throw things over the wall to the development organization and be able to trust that the development organization is going to get them what they need. And so, a lot of times when that's happening, you're just like dealing with like good old fashioned resource constraints, and people don't know how to show up for each other and contribute in the way. So a lot of times, when you really get into this, there's just a lot of things you have to change, because if you want the business to participate, you've got to give them a really good reason to show up. You've got to give them a really cool set of tools to exploit. And then sometimes you've got to change the way that the organization is looking at their contribution and what they're responsible for. Because if they're not available because they have other responsibilities, then, really difficult to get them to participate. So just lots of different things. Sometimes Agile is viewed as just something that the teams do, and it's something that doesn't impact the business. And so if the organization believes that it's just another way to build software and it's just what the developers do, well, then we're going to be at a disadvantage when we're trying to change hearts and minds. So a lot of the resistance to change just really comes down to, what do people believe? What do they think is true? Sometimes it's like what they want to be true. And then sometimes that's driven by just constraints and time and the way the organization is happening. So again, to overcome that, like what you're trying to do is, to the best of your ability, is to paint a complete picture of what this needs to look like when we're done, and then to put together a really solid roadmap on how we're going to incrementally and iteratively make these changes so that people can begin to step into this new way of working. As we step into this new operating model and we build trust in the new operating model, after a period of time, it just becomes the way we work. But it's a process, and you have to be very, very intentional about it, because there is a lot of resistance. It's all around belief and capacity for the most part, though. So let's talk a little bit about who is responsible for change and change management. It's kind of a complicated question, because what you recognize inherently when you take a systems first approach and you recognize that it's not just practices and it's not just culture. Like, we're changing things that have to be, those changes have to be approved. They have to be funded at the C-level. Right? So ultimately, the chief information officer, the chief product officer, usually the CFOs are involved. Sometimes in some organizations, the CEO is involved. So those are the people that ultimately sponsor this, and that ultimately have to be willing to support this vision for change. Almost always, though, the actual execution goes down to lower levels of management, right? And so sometimes it's SVPs and VPs and directors that are participating in the ESCs and the transformation leadership teams that we talked about earlier. And so so a lot of the ways I'll often explain this is, we have to have top-down intent, right? So leadership has to be fully bought into it, and the middle management has to be enlisted to actually drive and execute the change. But again, at the work surface level, right, the people in the organization, they have to be enlisted too, right? You can tell people, like, this is your new team, this is your new way of working, these are the new attitudes and beliefs that we're going towards. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't make sense to them, right, if they're not fully on board, then we're going to have challenges in that direction as well. So just at a high level, thematically, we need to try to get the senior leaders enlisted, and then we need to try to get the teams enlisted. It's not totally uncommon for us to go into a large organization where we have access, let's say at a VP level or director level, and we're dealing with a handful of teams. But the idea is to get a proven working model and then work our way up the stack. But for ultimately large-scale enterprise change, right, the higher level of sponsorship that you have, the more likely that you're going to be successful. Now, tactically, right, when you get into a transformation, one of the things that will often create is something called like an Agile Transformation office. So think like almost like a PMO kind of a thing, a project management office for Agile change, but it's different. Right. So in a lot of large organizations that we go in and we work with, we'll create, it'll be run by a leader The level of leader typically tends to vary, but it's somebody who has responsibility for that office. And so the mechanics of the change, the engaging of the organization, can often be like a director or a VP level person. They're usually responsible for a set of services. And those services might be often we'll call it like expedition onboarding. So once we have a candidate organization, somebody that shows up with desire and intent and a business problem to solve, and they're ready to get in queue for the transformation. A lot of times we'll do like a readiness step where we go and we look at it and we do some of the initial work and we look at like, are they on board with the teaming strategies and the governance models and the metrics and the tooling? Are they really prepared for what this is going to look like? Do they have the right people involved? Do they have leadership support? Do they have funding for the transformation? So there's an element of expedition onboarding. And then once they're kind of approved to go, do they have the capacity to participate in the divine, the end state work? Do they have the capacity to go through the change and the trainings and all the different things? In general, change happens in place. So people are doing the work. It's not like you have to go offline or, really slow down. I mean, there's a lot you can do, while things are in flight. So the readiness is really like looking at organization to organization and just formally onboarding them and making sure that there's a really solid plan. Agile Transformation Office will often have things like metrics services, tooling services, coaching services, training services, different things that are required to basically be able to support and maintain the transformation over time. So thematically, we have this idea of top-down, bottom-up. Leadership has to be responsible for and own the transformation. One of the things we like to talk about in Leading Agile is we'll say things like, we can't do it for you, we can't do it to you, we can only do it with you. And what that means is that it is largely up to our clients to own the transformation, for that group of senior leaders to be setting direction and setting vision for the change. We become an enabler of that, but it's ultimately their initiative that is getting driven out. And then part of that is once that space has been established, the idea of the expeditions and what base camps we're going to and what teams get enlisted how, you have to engage participation in that. So the responsibility for change, very much top down, but also very much bottom up. Mechanically, tactically, we have this idea of the Agile Transformation Office that is doing the onboarding, doing the funding, getting folks into queue, aligning people and resources to do the transformation work, and then building the services and the playbooks and all the things that are necessary, the tooling strategies to actually make it real. So tactically, there's usually like a transformation office or a small subset of people that are proactively driving and making sure things are happening. That's where Leading Agile tends to be a part. But at the end of the day, it's the senior leadership team that is sponsoring, driving, supporting, and then the teams that are getting enlisted and being responsible for participating and doing the things that we need them to do. So it's not really like a clean answer, like it's this person or that person. It's really the system of transformation that you install that actually creates the conditions organizationally so that the change is structured, planned, predicted, and is actually achieving the goals that we set out to achieve. As you're going through change and you look for a consulting partner to do this with you, the question that you might ask is the consulting partner there forever? Is the consulting partner there required to sustain the change? Or does at some point the organization have the ability not only to continue the change, but also to do the continuous improvement around it? So I talked about the idea of an Agile Transformation Office. If you look at Leading Agile, I've often conceptualized Leading Agile as almost like an Agile Transformation Office in the cloud, right? So we have training services and coaching services and expedition onboarding services and tooling services. We have our own internal playbooks. We have our own internal software that we use to manage transformation for our clients. It's actually a very well thought out, very structured and very disciplined system that we've come up with. So if you think about the idea of like software in the cloud versus software on-prem, right? One of the ways that you can look at what we're doing, if our clients ask us to do this, is that we can come in and we can be your transformation office in the cloud. But then what we will do over time is to instantiate that capability within the clients that we work with. How that typically looks, right? So I mentioned, all these different services: expedition onboarding, expedition readiness, coaching services, training services, metric services, tooling services, right? Those are all the things that a company needs to do to be able to do this on their own. So a typical, like, really large scale transformation. And now when I say large scale, we're talking tens of thousands of people. And, when you're dealing with tens of thousands of people, a couple things happen. It's really difficult to go as far and as fast as you need without really sending an army of people into it. Now, the other side of that is like there's just not an army of people that know how to do this stuff. And so one large client that we worked with over the last couple years, I think at one point, we were doing about 13,000 people. And the way it worked is there's about 45 of us, but there were 250 other either internal people or people from lower cost consultancies, people doing more team level stuff, developer coaching, things like that, where what we really did is we created a scaled framework where you had your transformation office, you had LeadingAgile supporting the expedition readiness and all of the different expedition orchestration. But then what you start to do is you start to enlist other parts of the client organization to start to fill in gaps. And so early in a transformation, it's very LeadingAgile heavy and candidly expensive, right? It's not sustainable though, but it requires a lot of heavy lifting to be able to get the initial expeditions done, to get the Agile Transformation Office set up, to start to find people within the client's organization that can actually do this work. But once you start to have that functioning core, what starts to happen is you create more of a scaled coaching framework where LeadingAgile tends to do more of the orchestration and the high level, stitching the entire transformation together, and you start to push out more of the changes and the execution of the changes into the people that exist in the organization. And then over time, what starts to happen is that the organization is capable of taking over its own transformation office and continuing to run internally. What you would ideally like to see is the Agile Transformation Office at some point not really being about transformation per se, but the idea of continuous improvement. Because here's the interesting thing. When we're talking about an Agile enterprise, there's a lot of times in Agile we talk about agility in the work we do or agility in the product area. And so like if I have a product and a collection of teams that are delivering that product, and I want to inspect and adapt my way into the best possible product I can get that's going to serve the most of my customers and drive the revenue. That's like one level of agility. But there's another level of agility that's really at like the business capability level. So organizations are not static, or at least they shouldn't be static, because our customers and markets are changing and we have to constantly adapt to the needs of our clients. We had a couple examples during the pandemic where like manufacturers are moving from producing the things they normally manufacture into working on PPE and respirators and things like that. So if a new set of capabilities arise that are needed, like how does the organization respond to that level of change? And so when we talk about transferring like an Agile Transformation Office into more like an office of the CIO or more of a continuous improvement kind of organization, you start to ask yourself things like, how are we monitoring the capabilities to make sure that they're performing at the level that we expect? Are we making the right investments in the right capabilities? Are the capabilities changing and evolving? Are they serving the needs of our client as is? And so this idea of instantiating the capabilities so that ultimately our clients have the ability to not only do this on their own, right? As they maybe acquire other organizations or they decide that, they're capable of doing it on their own, right? But then also the ability to use that capability to sustain ongoing adaptive change. Because again, it's not just product agility that we're looking for. We're looking for organizational agility and business agility. And so this idea of teams and loosely coupled, lightly orchestrated units is really what drives that. And so if we have systems in place in the organization that help us maintain that over time, then we're way more likely to win than if we just view the organization statically. So, last bit, like LeadingAgile, Agile Transformation services in the cloud, instantiate those services so at some point the organization is capable of doing these kinds of changes on their own. And then regardless, at some point once change is over, you have to recognize that this is an organizational agility initiative, and we have to make sure that we have the appropriate systems and controls so that the organization itself continuously inspect and adapt, not just the product.